Her tribe marked her with ashes and left her almost clothless, but one man gave her his shirt.
Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
Dry River Wash, Arizona Territory, late winter, 1882. Silas Greeley wasn't out here by choice. He hadn't ridden down into the old wash to scout or hunt or take in the air. A section of fence had come loose the night before. A post snapped clean from frost swell, and 3 of his yearling steers had gone missing before dawn. Tracks in the dirt told him they'd wandered down into the gully, maybe chasing water that wasn't there. He figured he'd find bones. Coyotes, maybe buzzards. What he didn't expect was a person. And not just any person, a woman. He saw her just past the bend, lying still near the dry roots of a sun-bleached cottonwood. At first glance, she looked like wind-blown debris. Scraps of hide, strands of hair, a body hunched and curled like it had been there a while. His mare stopped short. Silas tightened the reins slowly, heart ticking up. He didn't move for a second, just stared. Then he dismounted. His boots landed with a hard thud in the dust. Rifle slung across his back. He kept a steady pace as he approached. He didn't reach for his gun. She wasn't moving, wasn't holding anything, just lying there like the desert had spit her out and given up on her. As he got closer, he saw the ash. It was smeared across her shoulders, neck, chest, even part of her face. Not natural, not dirt from crawling or falling. Ritual ash, tribal. His brow tightened. The way it marked her, dark, deliberate, rubbed into her skin in wide swaths, told him she hadn't done it herself. Then he saw what she was wearing, or rather, what she wasn't. A single strip of torn deerskin was tied loosely at her hips. It barely covered her. Her thighs were bare, streaked with dust and sunburn. Her chest was mostly exposed, upper curves of her breasts visible through the shredded top that had clearly been ripped away. Ash caked the space between her collarbones. Her stomach rose and fell, but shallow. A rib protruded. She was thin, starved. Punishment. He'd seen it once before, years ago during the war, when a young Comanche girl had refused to be taken as a bride by a war chief. They left her like this too. Marked, stripped, cast out to die in shame. He crouched next to her, not touching her, just kneeling beside her in the brutal silence. She was Apache, no doubt about it. Young, early 20s maybe. Her face, beneath the grime and ash, was striking. High cheekbones, wide brow, full mouth. Her hair was a tangled mess, long and black, with feathers and burned beads caught in the strands. She looked like she had walked out of the fire and collapsed before she could find shade. Silas swallowed hard. His jaw tensed. She stirred slightly. Not much, just a twitch of her shoulder, a sound in her throat too dry to carry. Still alive? He didn't hesitate after that. He stripped off his coat, then his flannel shirt beneath it. The wind cut across his bare chest, but he didn't flinch. Moving slowly, carefully, he leaned over and draped the shirt across her body, first over her shoulders, then down across her chest and stomach. He made sure it reached her thighs. He never touched her skin. Her eyes fluttered, just for a second. She didn't speak, didn't try to move, but she saw him, and she didn't pull away. That was enough. He hooked his arms under her, lifting her as gently as he could. She was lighter than expected, too light. Her legs dangled like a doll's. The heat coming off her wasn't sunburn, it was fever. Silas turned toward his wagon. No one saw them. No one would. His ranch sat 3 miles north. Nothing but open land between here and there. The only ones to judge him were the hawks circling overhead and the shadow of his own past. He laid her in the back of the wagon, padded with an old horse blanket. Then he climbed onto the bench and slapped the reins. The horse moved slow, steady. Behind him, the girl didn't make a sound. Background, in narrative context. Silas Greeley, age 42, had been living alone for 7 years. He came to Arizona after the war, trying to outrun what had happened at Spotsylvania and the grave he dug for his wife outside St. Louis. The cabin he built was meant for 2, but only one ever stayed. He worked cattle, fixed fences, trapped in winter. That was his life. Quiet, controlled, isolated. He didn't go into town unless he had to didn't speak unless someone spoke first. And even then, he kept it short. He'd seen violence, both from war and from men pretending they were better than it. But what he saw that day in the wash hit different. There was no honor in how that girl had been left. No pride, just cruelty. And she wasn't even dead yet. Silas didn't know what to call it. Mercy, duty, instinct, but when he wrapped his shirt around her body and lifted her into the wagon, something shifted in him. Not loud, not dramatic, just shifted. He didn't plan to rescue anyone that day. He just couldn't leave her there. The wagon wheels creaked against the hard-packed earth as Silas urged the horse north, away from the river wash, toward the low rise where his cabin stood against a line of cottonwoods. The sun was dropping behind the ridges now, casting long shadows across the land. The wind had calmed, but the cold was settling in fast. February always tricked men into thinking spring was near. But out here in the Arizona territory, it could still kill you by morning. The girl didn't stir. He glanced back once. She lay under the blanket now, wrapped in his shirt and what little cloth he'd had in the back. Her face, half buried in her own hair, was slack. One arm had slipped free, thin and bruised near the elbow. Ash still clung to her collarbone. He didn't know if she'd make it through the night, but he was damn sure she wouldn't have made it where she'd been. As the wagon rolled into the clearing near his cabin, Silas let the horse slow and stop just short of the barn. He climbed down, not rushing, just moving with the tired precision of a man used to doing everything alone. He opened the cabin door first. The inside was small, one room, stone hearth, plank floor, caught against the far wall, a table and 2 chairs, though only one ever got used. It was clean, practical, and cold as hell inside. He lit the oil lamp, then stirred the fire back to life with a few dry logs. It didn't take long to warm. He had to be efficient out here. He came back for her next. When he lifted her out of the wagon, she made a sound, a shallow, pained moan, but didn't wake. Her head lolled against his chest. He carried her straight inside and laid her on the cot. The mattress was thin, but the blanket was thick. He tucked it around her carefully, still avoiding contact with her skin where he could. She was burning up. He fetched water from the barrel outside, poured it into a tin basin, and soaked a clean rag. When he sat beside her and touched the cloth to her forehead, her body flinched. Reflex, a muscle memory of fear. He pulled his hand back. "You're safe here," he muttered. It wasn't for her. It was for him. To hear it said. He cooled her skin as best he could. Let her rest. He didn't undress her. Didn't need to. What little she wore was already hanging by threads, and she was covered now. But he saw the bruising, the way the ash had been smeared over her breasts, her ribs. Someone had done this to make her small, to humiliate her. Not just exile shame. He didn't know why her people had cast her out. Maybe she'd refused a marriage. Maybe she'd disobeyed some elder. He didn't care. Not right now. She was still breathing. That was what mattered. Later, he set a pot of beans to boil and hung coffee over the fire. As night fell, the lights softened inside the cabin, and the world outside turned black and silent. He sat at the table, staring at the flames, back hunched, hands wrapped around a tin mug. He couldn't sleep in a cot. Not now. Not with her lying in it, half-conscious, fevered. So he grabbed a wool blanket from the shelf and laid it on the floor near the hearth. He took his boots off, rolled up his coat for a pillow, and stretched out fully clothed. But he didn't close his eyes. Every time she shifted or coughed, he listened. Every time the wind scratched against the walls, he sat up and looked to the door. At one point, near midnight, she cried out. A single, sharp sound, guttural, like it had clawed its way from her stomach. She was dreaming. Her arms twitched beneath the blanket. She turned her face toward the wall. He didn't wake her, just sat beside the fire and watched. He remembered that sound. He made it once, himself, 17 years ago in Virginia, when the cannon fire stopped and the smoke cleared and he realized half his company wasn't breathing anymore. The kind of noise that didn't come from the throat. It came from somewhere deeper. By dawn, the fever hadn't broken, but she was still alive. He fed the horse, shoveled out the manure, and brought in more wood for the stove. Then he came back in and left a tin cup filled with water near her hand. Bread too, a small piece wrapped in cloth. He didn't try to speak to her, didn't ask her name, Didn't ask if she could understand him. She might. She might not. Either way, it didn't matter yet. He just let her rest. Hours passed. Around midday, he came back in from the barn. The fire was steady, the air warm. The cot was empty. He stopped, not startled, not afraid, just still. She was crouched near the corner, hunched down in the same shirt he'd given her, blanket around her shoulders, eyes wide and dark. She hadn't run. She could have. She hadn't. She didn't look at him. Her hands were clenched around the cup, drinking water in short, shaky gulps. Her cheeks were flushed from fever, but her eyes were alert now, aware. Watching everything, tracking him like a hunted animal. He stepped once toward the table, slow, sat down, unfolded a piece of jerky from his coat pocket, and left it on the edge for her to see. Then went back to fixing the torn harness he'd been meaning to repair. She didn't speak, but when he glanced up again, the bread was gone. He didn't smile, but something in his chest, something that had been wound tight for years, moved. She was staying. For now. And that was enough. The days that followed passed without a single spoken word. But every hour held weight. She stayed close to the walls, never turning her back on him. She didn't sleep much, not when he was near. He heard her moving at night, soft steps pacing in the dark when the fire died down. Twice, he woke to find her crouched by the door, clutching the blanket tight around her chest, as if expecting someone to burst through at any moment. She never asked where she was or who he was, but she hadn't tried to leave. That was something. Silas didn't press her. He kept to routine, fed the horse, mended a bridle, hauled in wood. He moved steady, predictable, careful not to startle her. Every action, every motion, he made slower than usual. Not weak, just deliberate. He wasn't used to company, not anymore, and the last thing he wanted was to make her feel cornered. He didn't know her name, didn't ask. He figured if she wanted to tell him, she would. But one afternoon, 3 days after he'd brought her in, while he was slicing jerky at the table and she was crouched near the fire with a needle and some of his spare cloth, she said it, quiet, like testing if it was safe to let it exist out loud. "Saya." He looked up. She didn't repeat it, didn't look at him, just kept sewing, hands unsteady but focused. She was trying to fashion something out of his worn linen, a top, maybe a shift, cut loose and wide to fit her. His shirt still hung off her shoulders, sliding too low when she moved. She didn't try to adjust it around him anymore, but her discomfort was visible. Not shame exactly, just the need to feel like she owned what was covering her. "Saya," he said back, voice low. A pause passed. Then she nodded once. Barely noticeable. That was the first thread of something real between them. That evening, she took a step further. He came in from chopping wood and found the table wiped clean, the hearth swept. The pot of beans he'd left out had been stirred, warmed over the fire. She sat on the floor beside it, her legs pulled up under the shirt and blanket, still keeping distance, but clearly no longer afraid to move in the space. He didn't say anything, just nodded, grabbed a tin bowl, and ladled food for both of them. They ate in silence. Not stiff, just quiet. She had cleaned her face earlier that day. Her skin, though still flushed from fever, was no longer streaked with soot. The bruising on her arms was healing. Her lips weren't cracked anymore. She'd even cut some of the tangles from her hair, though the charred beads were still woven into the strands. She wasn't better. Not yet. But she was no longer waiting to die. Silas noticed something else that night. Her eyes kept going to the shelf beside his cot. On it were two objects, an old tobacco tin and a cloth-wrapped parcel. She didn't touch them, but he saw the curiosity. He didn't explain what they were, but the fact that she noticed meant she was paying attention now, making sense of where she was. She wasn't just surviving, she was observing. Later, after she curled up by the fire and pulled the blanket over her shoulders, he sat at the table and tried to read a few pages of the tattered book he kept, an Army-issued manual on Western scouting techniques, mostly useless now. But his eyes didn't focus on the words. He kept thinking about how close she'd come to dying out there. And why? There were still questions, of course. Why had her tribe cast her out? What exactly had she refused? Had she been married? Was she fleeing something worse than exile? But he didn't ask. He'd seen too many men demand answers from people too raw to give them. She wasn't ready. And truth be told, neither was he. What he did do was leave her alone for half the day next morning. Told her, by gesture, he'd be checking the southern fence. He wasn't sure she understood, but when he returned, she was still there. The fire was going. The cabin had been swept again, and on the table was the linen top she'd been working on, folded neatly. It was poorly stitched, uneven in places, but it was hers. She'd made it with his scraps, his thread, her time. Later that evening, she wore it. She'd bathed, too. Hair damp, braided simply. She came out of the wash basin with wet shoulders and fresh skin. Her body, though still marked with fading bruises, no longer looked abandoned. The cloth top hung loosely over her chest and down past her hips. It didn't hide her curves completely, but it was hers now, not a shirt lent in pity, not a strip of hide forced on her in punishment. It was her own doing, and she walked with her back a little straighter. That night, when she passed him his tin cup of coffee, her fingers touched his. She didn't pull away. He didn't either. It was the smallest thing, but it stayed with him. She'd spoken her name, cleaned his table, sewed her own clothes, stayed when she could have run, touched his hand. Silas knew better than to rush things. He wasn't looking for gratitude. He wasn't looking for a woman, either, not after what he'd lost. But he also wasn't blind. Something was forming in the quiet. Not forgiveness, not love, not yet, but something worth protecting. And for a man like him, that was more than enough to keep going. The weather turned colder again, despite the nearing spring. Dry wind swept across the hills, and frost gathered on the edges of the trough before sunrise. The cabin creaked at night as the boards shrank in the cold. But inside, the fire stayed lit, and for the first time in years, Silas wasn't the only one tending it. Saya had begun rising early. Not before him. He was always first, but not long after. She moved quietly through the cabin, her feet bare against the floor, the hand-stitched linen top draping off one shoulder, her long dark hair braided back and tied with a scrap of cord she'd found. Her presence had changed the rhythm of the place. It wasn't just chores getting done. It was how she moved in the space, how she cleaned the oil lamp without being asked, how she refolded the blankets with neatness that hadn't been there before. There was order again, not just survival. One morning, Silas walked in from the barn with a bucket of milk and stopped short. She was sweeping the floor with a pine branch broom. Her new dress, still pieced together from his old shirts and spare canvas, clung at the waist and chest in a way that made his jaw tighten. She noticed him, stopped. For the first time, she held his gaze. Not long, just a breath, but it held. Then she turned back to what she was doing, as if to say, I see you, and I'm still here. He set the bucket down without a word. That same day, while cleaning the tool shed, Silas noticed something he hadn't in days. She had put the beads back in her hair. They were small, blackened from fire, and partially cracked, but she'd worked them into the end of one braid. 3 in total. He didn't comment, but it told him something she hadn't said. She wasn't trying to forget where she came from. She just wasn't letting it define her anymore. Later that afternoon, she came outside with a bucket and followed him to the barn without asking. She watched as he repaired a loose plank on the stall door, kneeling in the dirt, hammer in hand. After a while, without a word, she stepped forward and held the bore in place so he could drive the nail straight. Her fingers were calloused now. Her hands didn't shake. He didn't thank her, not because he wasn't grateful, but because she seemed to prefer it that way. Instead, when they were done, he handed her his knife and pointed toward the pile of rawhide in the shed. He'd seen her glance at it before. Apache women knew how to cure and work hide better than most settlers. She took the blade, knelt, and began working the strips into long, thin cords. He didn't correct her. She didn't ask for help. Hours passed like that. Quiet, useful, shared. By evening, the sun dropped into a haze of gold and dust across the plain. Inside, she stirred the beans while he chopped kindling. When they sat down to eat, he poured her coffee without being asked. She took it without hesitation. A small thing happened then. She leaned forward across the table to reach the salt tin. Her neckline slipped slightly, exposing the slope of her chest. He caught out of the corner of his eye, froze for a half second. She noticed. Her hand paused on the tin. Then she glanced at him. He didn't look away this time, but he didn't stare. He just met her eyes and stayed there, letting her decide whether it mattered. After a moment, she set down the salt and kept eating. The next morning, it was her who poured the coffee first. That evening, she sat beside him on the porch bench. It was the first time she'd chosen to sit that close. The breeze had picked up, and she wore one of his coats around her shoulders, sleeves rolled to the elbows. She didn't speak. Neither did he, but her leg brushed his. She didn't move it. Neither did he. He felt the warmth of her thigh through the fabric. She folded her hands at her lap and leaned back, letting the wind comb through the loose ends of her braid. After a while, she shifted, rested her head against his shoulder. He didn't move, didn't breathe deep, just stayed still, eyes on the darkening sky, heart working a little harder in his chest than usual. And then, softly, she said the first full sentence he'd heard from her. "Why did you help me?" It wasn't accusatory, just real. He thought for a long time before answering. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady. "Because no one else did." That was all he said, and she nodded like it was enough. It was the only answer he had. He didn't need to tell her about the wife buried behind the cabin, about how she'd gotten sick during the first winter and never recovered, how the silence of this place had grown louder every year since, how he'd stopped riding into town because there wasn't anyone worth talking to, how he'd once believed the only thing left for him was fence posts and cattle and the sound of wind under the eaves. Now she was here, and everything had shifted. She sat beside him until the last of the sun disappeared. When they stood, he stepped aside to let her enter the cabin first. As she passed, her hand brushed his, purposefully this time, slowly. He didn't reach for it, but he felt it long after she'd walked away. That night, she slept in the cot again. He slept on the floor. But both of them knew, without saying it, that they were no longer strangers in that room. Not anymore. And by morning, something wordless between them had settled like the ash that once marked her skin. Quiet, lasting, and no longer a symbol of shame. The days blended into one another with a quiet rhythm, as if the land had finally stopped holding its breath. March brought thawed ground and longer light, though the nights still cut cold. The silence between Silas and Saya wasn't heavy anymore. It was the silence of routine, of two people sharing the same space, the same work, without needing to explain themselves. Still, there were things left unsaid, questions neither had asked out loud. That morning, Silas sat sharpening his old skinning knife at the edge of the porch, his hat pulled low against the glare. Saya was in the garden bed behind the cabin, turning the soil with a short-handled hoe. Her dress, now fitted and patched with care, clung to her back with sweat. He glanced over once and caught her adjusting the strap at her shoulder, exposing the smooth slope of her collarbone. She felt him watching and paused, then kept working. They didn't speak, but the air between them had changed. What had once been avoidance had grown into awareness. Inside, the cabin was different now, too. She had organized the shelves, tucked his folded shirts into a pine crate, laid fresh cloth over the table. There was a dried herb bundle above the hearth she'd made from something she'd foraged. The room smelled faintly of sage now, and not just smoke. After lunch, she surprised him. He was fixing a split stirrup when she walked into the barn and knelt beside him, holding a small parcel wrapped in hide. She didn't say anything, just set it beside him. He opened it slowly, wary, confused, and inside was a small, carved figure. Simple, made of bone, a woman kneeling, Apache style. His chest tightened. "I made it," she said. He looked at her. Her voice was quiet, but sure. "For your wife," she added. "The grave." He hadn't told her about the grave. Not directly, but she'd seen the wooden cross behind the barn, the way he avoided looking at it whenever he walked past. She must have pieced it together. Her people knew how to read signs. He swallowed hard, eyes on the carving. It wasn't pretty, but it was made with care. The figure's head was bowed slightly, arms across her chest. Mourning, maybe? Respect. Silas didn't speak. He couldn't. But after a moment, he nodded, stood, and walked out to the grave. She followed. He knelt at the edge of the mound, brushed the pine needles away from the base of the cross, and placed the figure there, near the foot, then stepped back. She stood beside him, hands folded in front of her. He He finally spoke. Her name was Clara. Saya didn't ask more. Just let it settle. Later that evening, they sat at the table, eating quietly as usual. But something had lifted. She seemed lighter, even smiled once when he accidentally spilled salt and muttered under his breath. When he looked up, surprised by her reaction, she didn't hide her face like before. Her eyes held his. "You curse like a soldier," she said, voice dry. "I was one," he replied. And just like that, another truth landed between them. He hadn't said it aloud before. Not to her. Not to anyone since the war ended. He wasn't proud of what he'd done. Riding scout for Union Command, hunting trails through Apache land. He had his reasons, same as anyone, but reasons didn't clean blood from memory. She didn't look angry, just nodded. "I figured," she said, then added, "You walk like one." That night, after the fire burned low and he settled onto the floor like always, she hesitated. He watched from where he lay, expecting her to blow out the lamp and crawl into the cot. Instead, she stood over him for a long moment. The hem of her dress brushed his arm. Then, gently, she bent down. Her fingers touched his scar, the one on his ribs just beneath the edge of his shirt. She traced it lightly, barely pressure, just contact. It wasn't a question. It wasn't pity. It was knowledge. "I know what it feels like," she whispered. Her eyes flicked up to his. To be marked. He didn't answer. Didn't need to. He just reached up, slowly, and touched her wrist. She didn't flinch. And for the first time since he'd found her half dead and covered in ash, she leaned in and pressed her forehead lightly to his. Not a kiss. Not yet. Just closeness. Something held. Then she stood, quietly moved to the cot, and lay down. He stayed awake a long time, staring at the rafters, the shape of her figure outlined in firelight. Her breathing slowed. Her shoulders rose and fell. He hadn't meant to care this much, but here she was, still breathing, still here, and so was he. That night changed something. Neither of them said it, but they both felt it. The air between them no longer carried distance. It didn't mean they touched freely or spoke openly, but there was a shift, a quiet understanding. In the days that followed, Saya no longer avoided brushing past him. She moved through the cabin as if she belonged there now. Not as a guest, not as someone waiting to leave, but as someone claiming space. She tended the fire before he rose, washed his shirt without being asked, and he let her. One morning, while Silas was repairing a broken gate hinge, he saw her outside with the pail, kneeling at the stream that ran faint behind the barn. Her sleeves were rolled, and the fabric clung to her hips as she worked. She was rinsing root vegetables she'd dug from the edge of the brush. The water sparkled over her arms, her skin smooth now where the bruises had faded. She didn't glance at him. She didn't need to. That afternoon, she set a bowl of stew in front of him, then sat across the table, resting her elbows and sipping from her cup. Her posture was easy. Her eyes met his and didn't look away. "Your people," he said quietly, pausing mid-bite. "They might come looking." She was quiet for a moment. Then, no. He didn't press. But she went on anyway, voice steady. "They made a choice. I made mine." He nodded slowly. The clarity of her tone told him more than the words did. Whatever had happened, whatever customs or rules had been broken, was not something she regretted. She had lived with those people all her life, and now she was rebuilding that life from scraps. She didn't ask what he meant by "your people." She understood he meant her tribe, her past, what she'd left or been torn from. And she made it clear, without anger, that it was behind her now. That evening, they sat side by side on the porch again. It had become routine after supper, him sipping coffee, her braiding her hair while watching the sky turn to dusk. But this time, she did something different. She turned to him and held out the end of her braid. He looked at it, then at her. She gave the faintest nod. He took it in his hands, rough, calloused fingers, and tied off the end with the same strip of cloth she always used. Not perfect, a bit loose. She smiled. Then, before he could set it down, she leaned forward and kissed him. It wasn't long. It wasn't desperate, just slow and warm, her lips soft against his, her breath catching gently in her nose. Her hand rested against his chest, fingers curling slightly over the fabric of his shirt. He didn't pull away. When she did, She lingered close. You never asked what they did to me, she whispered. Silas swallowed. I figured you'd tell me if you wanted. I don't want to, she said quietly. But I want you to know this. What they took wasn't mine to give. He understood. The language didn't need to be exact. Pain like that left its own kind of truth, and her voice carried it without needing detail. I didn't save you for that, he said. I know. The wind stirred between them. Her braid brushed his shoulder. I chose to stay, she added. You didn't ask me to. I wouldn't. That night, she didn't go to the cot. She knelt before the hearth as the fire dimmed, then stood and crossed the cabin in silence. He watched from the chair where he sat, unlacing his boots. She reached for his hand. He rose. She led him to the bed. They didn't speak. There was no ceremony, no plan. Just the slow unbuttoning of his shirt, the way her fingers traced each line of his chest, the way he paused at the curve of her waist, waiting. Her breath was warm against his collarbone. Her body, strong and full and real, met his without shame. He touched her gently, always watching her eyes. She didn't flinch. The firelight flickered across the walls as they lay down. She guided his hand over her ribs, where the ash had once been smeared. He kissed her there, slowly, tenderly. Their movements were unhurried, careful, intimate, honest. When her breath hitched and her fingers gripped his shoulders, he stilled, waiting for her to lead. She did, and when it was over, they didn't pull away. They stayed wrapped together under the blanket, her head resting beneath his chin, her hand over the scar on his side. He closed his eyes and felt her heartbeat against his chest. It was the first night in years he didn't wake alone, and neither did she. In the silence, there was no need for vows, no declarations. But the way she held him said everything. I stayed, and I'm not afraid anymore. The morning after they lay together for the first time, the cabin felt warmer even though the fire had burned low. Silas stirred first, careful not to wake her. Saya's body was curled against his, her hand resting on his chest, one leg draped over his thigh beneath the blanket. Her hair was spread across the pillow they now shared, and her breathing was steady, deep, untroubled. He hadn't seen anyone sleep like that in his bed in 7 years. He stared at the ceiling beams for a long while, unmoving. Part of him still expected it to vanish, that she'd disappear like a fever dream, that he'd find himself alone again. But when she shifted and mumbled softly in her sleep, her hand tightening briefly over his chest, he knew this was no dream. When she finally opened her eyes, she didn't flinch, didn't pull the blanket up to hide her body. She just looked at him. They stayed like that for several minutes. No words, no rush. Eventually, she sat up, the blanket draping low over her hips. He saw her silhouette outlined in the gray morning light, her back strong, her shoulders no longer hunched, her skin bare, but without shame. The ash, the bruises, the marks, they were gone now. Or rather, they no longer defined her. She turned slightly and said, "Do you regret it?" He didn't have to think. No. She nodded once, as if confirming something she'd already believed. That morning, they moved together through the cabin like they'd done it for years. She cooked while he hauled feed. He poured her coffee. She refolded the blankets without asking. But the space between them now held a quiet closeness. An invisible thread stretched between their gestures, even in silence. Later, while Silas was splitting it out back, she walked up with 2 small bundles in her arms. He set down the axe and straightened. "Found these in the storage chest," she said. One bundle held faded blue fabric from an old army coat he hadn't worn since before Clara died. The other was a strip of canvas and a spool of thread. "I thought I'd sew something for you," she said, eyes steady on his. He wiped his brow with his sleeve and nodded. "All right." She paused. "It won't be pretty. Don't need it to be." She smiled faintly and went back inside. That evening, she handed him the result, a new shirt. It was plain and stiff, and the sleeves were uneven. But when he pulled it on, it fit. She watched him adjust the collar, and her fingers came up to help smooth the fold at his neck. "You look like yourself," she said quietly. He wasn't sure what she meant. Maybe he didn't look like a man haunted anymore. Maybe to her he looked whole. That night, while she swept near the hearth, he brought out something he hadn't touched in years. A small cedar box, kept on the top shelf. He set it on the table. She stopped sweeping. He opened it slowly and pulled out a simple copper ring. "This was Clara's," he said, "but she's gone, and she wanted me to give it to someone who could wear it." He didn't move to put on her. He just laid it on the table. "If you want it," he added. Saya stepped forward, eyes on the ring. She didn't pick it up right away. "I'm not her," she said. "I know. I won't be what you had before." He looked at her. "I don't want what I had before. I want what I have now." She stared at him for a long moment, then reached down, took the ring, and slid it on her own finger. It fit loosely, but she didn't mind. She looked up, jaw set firm. "Then I stay." He nodded once. "You already have." They didn't call it marriage. No preacher had blessed it. No neighbors knew. But the next morning, they built a second chair together. She helped him measure the wood, laughing when he miscounted the notches, and he let her tease him. He nailed the pieces together while she sanded the edges. 2 chairs sat by the fire now. 2 cups on the shelf. 2 blankets folded at the foot of the bed. When the wind picked up again outside, she didn't reach for the door like she might flee. She reached for his hand. And for the first time in both their lives, neither of them felt alone. The morning after they lay together for the first time, the cabin felt warmer even though the fire had burned low. Silas stirred first, careful not to wake her. Saya's body was curled against his, her hand resting on his chest, one leg draped over his thigh beneath the blanket. Her hair was spread across the pillow they now shared, and her breathing was steady, deep, untroubled. He hadn't seen anyone sleep like that in his bed in 7 years. He stared at the ceiling beams for a long while, unmoving. Part of him still expected it to vanish, that she'd disappear like a fever dream, that he'd find himself alone again. But when she shifted and mumbled softly in her sleep, her hand tightening briefly over his chest, he knew this was no dream. When she finally opened her eyes, she didn't flinch, didn't pull the blanket up to hide her body. She just looked at him. They stayed like that for several minutes. No words, no rush. Eventually, she sat up, the blanket draping low over her hips. He saw her silhouette outlined in the gray morning light, her back strong, her shoulders no longer hunched, her skin bare, but without shame. The ash, the bruises, the marks, they were gone now. Or rather, they no longer defined her. She turned slightly and said, "Do you regret it?" He didn't have to think. "No." She nodded once, as if confirming something she'd already believed. That morning, they moved together through the cabin like they'd done it for years. She cooked while he hauled feed. He poured her coffee. She refolded the blankets without asking. But the space between them now held a quiet closeness. An invisible thread stretched between their gestures, even in silence. Later, while Silas was splitting wood out back, she walked up with 2 small bundles in her arms. He set down the axe and straightened. "Found these in the storage chest," she said. One bundle held faded blue fabric from an old army coat he hadn't worn since before Clara died. The other was a strip of canvas and a spool of thread. "I thought I'd sew something for you," she said, eyes steady on his. He wiped his brow with his sleeve and nodded. "All right." She paused. "It won't be pretty. Don't need it to be." She smiled faintly and went back inside. That evening, she handed him the result, a new shirt. It was plain and stiff, and the sleeves were uneven. But when he pulled it on, it fit. She watched him adjust the collar, and her fingers came up to help smooth the fold at his neck. "You look like yourself," she said quietly. He wasn't sure what she meant. Maybe he didn't look like a man haunted anymore. Maybe, to her, he looked whole. That night, while she swept near the hearth, he brought out something he hadn't touched in years. A small cedar box, kept on the top shelf. He set it on the table. She stopped sweeping. He opened it slowly and pulled out a simple copper ring. "This was Clara's," he said, "but she's gone, and she wanted me to give it to someone who could wear it." He didn't move to put it on her. He just laid it on the table. "If you want it," he added. Saya stepped forward, eyes on the ring. She didn't pick it up right away. "I'm not her," she said. "I know. I won't be what you had before." He looked at her. "I don't want what I had before. I want what I have now." She stared at him for a long moment, then reached down, took the ring, and slid it on her own finger. It fit loosely, but she didn't mind. She looked up, jaw set firm. Then I stay. He nodded once. You already have. They didn't call it marriage. No preacher had blessed it. No neighbors knew. But the next morning, they built a second chair together. She helped him measure the wood, laughing when he miscounted the notches, and he let her tease him. He nailed the pieces together while she sanded the edges. 2 chairs sat by the fire now. 2 cups on a shelf. 2 blankets folded at the foot of the bed. When the wind picked up again outside, she didn't reach for the door like she might flee. She reached for his hand. And for the first time in both their lives, neither of them felt alone. Spring deepened into early summer. The grass thickened around the fence lines, and the creek behind the barn began to run steady again. Days stretched long, warm, and filled with work, but the kind that felt like purpose, not burden. Silas and Saya had settled into something neither of them had dared hope for at the beginning of that long winter. Peace that stayed. The sapling behind the cabin took root. Each morning, Saya checked its leaves, brushed away the dry soil around the base, and watered it with the same care she gave the house and their life inside it. It grew slowly, but it grew. That was enough. One morning, she stepped out onto the porch with a quiet smile on her face. The air was cool still, the sun not yet over the ridge. She wore the same dress she'd stitched for herself months ago, now soft from wash and wear, but today her hair was braided back with fresh pieces of blue thread. Silas was chopping wood near the shed. When he saw her, he stopped. "You're up early," he said. She walked toward him, something in her hands wrapped in cloth. "I made something." He wiped his hands and took it from her gently. Inside was a small shirt, sewn with tighter stitches this time, clearly made with effort and time. It was too small for either of them. He looked at her slowly. She said nothing, just watched his face. Then, quietly, "It's not certain yet, but I think it is." He held the shirt for a long time. His voice, when it came, was low. "You sure?" She nodded, eyes glistening, not with fear, but something steadier. "I missed one moon. I feel different. My body, it's telling me something." He stepped forward and placed one hand on her waist, the other against her stomach. She covered it with both of hers. A long silence passed. Then he leaned in and kissed her, soft, slow, his lips pressed her forehead, then her mouth. "Then we'll raise them here," he said. "Together." It wasn't a promise he made lightly, and she knew that. That was why she leaned into his chest and let herself breathe deep, finally, without weight on her lungs. Later that week, they rode into town together. It had been almost a year since Silas had been seen with anyone. The people of Briar Hollow watched them when they stepped down from the wagon. Saya's skin, her dress, her Apache features, all of it drew stares. But Silas walked beside her without hesitation. His arm brushed hers as they entered the mercantile. She kept her chin high. He bought cloth, flour, tools. She chose blue ribbon, thread, and a pair of soft-soled boots for walking. Nobody said much, but the message was clear. He'd claimed her, and she had chosen to stay. On the ride back, she leaned against him in the wagon bed, eyes closed, wind in her braid. "You don't regret this?" she asked quietly. "All the things people might think." He didn't answer at first. Then, "I regret not meeting you sooner." When they returned home, she unpacked the supplies while he fixed the wagon wheel. That evening, they shared a quiet meal on the porch. The sky turned orange and pink over the distant ridge. The cattle moved slow in the field. The land looked alive again. She brought out the copper ring again, still a little loose on her finger. But this time, she took it off, handed it to him, and held out her hand. "You never asked," she said. He took her hand, slid the ring onto her finger again, slow and deliberate. "I don't need a preacher," she whispered. "Just you." He looked at her, voice steady. "Then you have me." And that was their wedding. No church, no audience, just a man and a woman, standing barefoot on their own land, with dirt under their nails and peace in their bones. The next morning, she stood in the doorway with her hand resting over her stomach. He walked up behind her, slid an arm around her waist, and rested his hand beside hers. Behind them, 2 chairs sat by the fire. Outside, the sapling had sprouted 2 new leaves. A home, a family, a life built not from saving, but staying. Everything that had once been torn from them was now theirs to rebuild. together. And this time, no one could take it away.
And that's it for today's video. Thank you so much for hanging out with Where Grit Meets Heart. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss out on what's next. See you soon.